Hi guys, welcome to our today's webinar devoted to teaching grammar. So without further ado, let me start sharing my screen with you. So I do believe that my slides are quite visible. So just to get started. So actually today we're going to discuss grammar, right? And we are supposed to be talking about both inductive and deductive grammar approaches. Basically, it's our today's core thing to work on. Before we get started, let me introduce myself. My name is Marina, and I'm both a corporate teacher and an expert in our TTC department. I've been working as a teacher of English for almost 9 years, and I've been working here in Scan for almost 2 years. And I'm just a TESOL certified teacher with quite a vast experience, and I'm a holder of different certificates. What makes me a good, I would say, person in this topic? So I have totally different students, but I'm constantly just using inductive grammar approach so as to engage my student and to make them active participants of our lessons. As for our today's agenda, what exactly are we going to do tonight? I would say, or today. So first and foremost, we'll be talking about two main approaches, deductive and deductive grammar approaches, what it is and what is better. Afterwards, we're going to build an inductive grammar lesson plan from scratch. By the end of the workshop, you'll have a full lesson plan that you can apply to all of your students whenever you're teaching a new grammar piece. And of course, we'll try to focus on MFP stages, how to elicit these stages, and there is going to be a lot of practice. So, to find out what we can do differently in terms of grammar, how to avoid giving out all the rules straight away, we would have to analyze our own lessons. I would say grammar lessons. Of course, we have to analyze what we do now already in terms of our own structure. So I'd like to ask you if you have some special frameworks or some typical procedure that you're constantly following so as to teach a new grammar piece. Probably you have some tricks, yeah, and some kind of clues in your pockets. As for our today's webinar, so we are going to be talking about two main approaches, inductive and deductive. And actually, in terms of even our context, we don't seem to have a certain system while teaching grammar, right? At least we might have a kind of combination of these two systems. But I would say that you might have heard about these two main approaches. And definitely, I'm pretty sure that we were taught deductively, right, in our schools when we were teenagers. We're given the rules just straight away, like in the following way form. Dear students, today we're going to be talking about present perfect. Present perfect is used when we want to talk about results, something like that. And afterwards, here is like a rule, here is a pattern, here are a few examples, and let's practice. Let's do some exercises. That is all. Basically, it's the most conventional way, right, how English lessons look like. And quite sometimes we would find it very daunting for our students, would give out the rule straight away, but then the student would be like asking you, why would I need it, right? Or some strange, for example, patterns could come to their mind. I might never use it. Why are you giving this rule? What for? But if you present this new grammar piece inductively, I would say that these questions would never appear. Because in this case, we would have slightly different sequence of all of the steps. I do believe that you can help me here with the sequence of steps. And how would it look like? What would we begin with, right? Here the idea is just the student is supposed to be exposed to the context first. And only then we would come to this rule. The language focus would come somewhere in the middle of the lesson, meaning that the student would have the context. And again, these questions, why would I need that, right? Probably would never appear in our students' head. This is why you need it. This is given in the text, right? That is basically one of the main points. And let us have a look at this sequence of, I would say, steps. So the first and foremost, our students would be exposed to the text with these examples. Then they would have to come to these patterns, and finally, they would have to discover the rule. Okay, but now let us see if you are able to identify these two main approaches in terms of materials. Let us play detectives, or let us take on a role of police inspector or something like that. So here you can see just a few materials from different course books and from our platform. In your opinion, which procedures shown here are purely inductive grammar materials and vice versa, purely deductive grammar materials, and why? Let's have a look at the first example. That is from our course book. And of course, you might have different opinions, right? If this material is purely inductive or inductive, but still the answer is this material is purely inductive, just because the main point of this grammar piece is to expose the student. First of all, the student is exposed to this text, and then afterwards, the student would have to analyze the structures that are underlined by means of answering these questions. For instance, in the underlined phrases, what tense is the verb after if? Or do the phrases refer to a situation they are imagining? And so on and so forth. The student has to come to the rule somehow. Of course, it might be a little bit more challenging or daunting when our student has to fill in some gaps, like in the second, for example, variant, like in the second activity, or they would have to analyze some structures like in this material. But the main idea is that the student might take an active part in the lesson. Of course, as for the second, again, piece of grammar, it's also purely inductive. I've already mentioned that the student is exposed to the text. There is some textual evidence, like look at the jobs in exercise number 1, and then our students will have to come to the rule. As for the third and the fourth material, they're purely deductive, just because there is no discovery here. The student is given all the rules on the spot simultaneously. There are some tables with these rules, there are some examples, but here I would say there is no discovery. And despite the fact that we might give some examples, for example, in number 3, there is again an explicit rule stated. As for the last two materials, one of them is purely inductive and vice versa. The second one is purely inductive, but which one? Let's have a look at the fifth one. That is a purely deductive grammar approach, because again, our students are provided with a table with all the rules and then patterns. And as for the last material, it's taken again from our platform. Here, the students are given like some examples, relevant examples on one topic, and then our students will have to come to the rule. That is a purely inductive grammar material. So in terms of both benefits and drawbacks, let's summarize briefly. We would have to come up with a few conclusions. Which grammar approach would we have to opt for and why? Some of you might have remembered that with senior learners, it works in such a way. They seem to be a little bit like conventional and conservative people, and they would want to have the rule explained by the teacher straightforwardly, without any analysis. But why might it be worse for them? Why would it be better to use inductive grammar approach even with senior learners? Of course, the main drawback is that they are more likely to forget it, because when they find out something themselves, right, they might remember it a bit better, right? Definitely better. That could be a possible drawback of deductive grammar approach. But of course, it is just still, there is such a kind of stereotype that older people just got used to deductive grammar approach due to the fact that it helps somehow to minimize the number of mistakes. Because the main goal of this approach is likely to be the following. Here, there is like accurate application of the rule, but it doesn't happen quite often. So if we're just doing, I would say, the lesson inductively, we procedurally imply that our goal is accuracy. Here, the student is more likely to be focusing on the form rather than the meaning. And that is why if we practice in such a way, right, ideally our students are supposed to be more accurate in comparison with inductive approach. But actually, again, it doesn't happen. And of course, there are such drawbacks as this lesson is considered to be a teacher-centered lesson. The student is supposed to be like a passive learner. Your student might start yawning on the lesson instead of active participation. And in case of inductive grammar approach, if we're so passionate about this approach, there are so many benefits of this approach. We're going to find out why it is better, if it is worth implementing or not. Of course, it's worth doing, just because first and foremost, it's a modern approach. Then it's more communicative, it's more memorable, but of course, it's not so time consuming. The reason why exactly inductive grammar teaching is a little bit better in terms of having the student memorize the rule is because they have more, I would say, they have more chances to connect the things they learn with the things they know. There is a kind of shorter gap between the teacher's output and the student's input. And let's have a look at a number of benefits. First and foremost, we're talking about a learner-centered lesson. Here, guided discovery might be used. It's more memorable, right? Most importantly, just following this approach, we apply that communication matters more than just the form. And we are going to be focused more on the meaning rather than form. Because here exactly, we're talking about the main goal of this particular approach. The main goal is delivering a message using new knowledge. Okay, but there is one more question in terms of even L1. How exactly does inductive grammar approach help limit L1? Also, that is a good question. And again, many minds, but still, if you are following inductive grammar approach, I do believe that your TTT might be lower than you might expect. After that, you might use less meta-language. I'm talking about such terms as predicate, adjective, adverb, and so on and so forth. In this particular case, if you are constantly following just the inductive grammar approach, you don't have to overload our students with these terms. And of course, there are more applications, real cases, rather than just abstractions. And for sure, so all your inductive grammar lessons might be turned into deductive grammar lessons and vice versa. But today, our goal is to build an inductive grammar lesson plan from scratch that you can take it away and apply to all of your students, right, without any problems. And we would have to start with warm-up and lead-in stages. That is a point of every single lesson, and our lessons cannot be started without these two stages. If we're talking about grammar lessons, what do you think will be important to mention when we are setting the goals and when we are explaining what you are going to do today? Let's have a look. What can be an aim of a grammar lesson that you can announce at the very beginning? Today we'll study present perfect. Today we'll study how to talk about your experiences. Or one more, today we'll study how to talk about how your lifestyle changed and what results you see in your life. Which is better? Of course, probably, again, there might be different answers from your side, but we do need to combine the two goals that I've just announced. We have to focus on where exactly we are supposed to use this grammar and set the context for that. If you don't know some grammar in the language you're learning, it doesn't help you much if you know how it is named, right? For example, the present perfect, but you don't know how to use it. You don't understand the essence of this tag. So the main focus should be on the use. So your aims should be quite practical. We're talking about application-focused lesson aims instead of theory-focused lesson aims. So you might present the aims of the lesson in the following way. For instance, today we'll study how to talk about your experience by means of present perfect. So we try to combine two things simultaneously. And of course, here you don't have to pay a lot of attention to the name of this tense, right? But you would have to pay your attention to the meaning of this tense. I would say it's definitely going to be much more useful if we focus on the function in any form. So let's proceed then with the second step that is called context setting and generating examples. If we're talking about inductive grammar approach and contextual so-called approach, we're implied to have examples to start teaching inductively. But where to find them? Of course, you might just answer in the following way. There are ready-made templates on the platform, and there are ready-made materials, and so on and so forth. But all of the sources that you might mention are either textual or audio. And of course, our general course that is based on New English File exploits heavily textual presentation, right, of grammar. And of course, we are teaching grammar lessons by means of these materials. But sometimes you might even need to find some extra materials to present new grammar pieces. And in this case, there are so many ways to do that. For example, YouTube videos, very short videos, or even songs, yeah, some lines of the songs, or even your student might provide you with some examples, really, minimal sentence pairs, generative situation like a role play, using the text, timeline, something like that. So actually, there are so many ways to do that. We can even use just different visuals. By visuals, I mean different like photos, pictures that would set the situation. You can use realia in your classes if we're talking about there is, there are, for example, or it could be generative situation, a kind of a role play when students have to act out and analyze grammar. Okay, so many ways to do that, I would say, in this particular case. But again, you have to take the following points into your account. We would have to consider what your examples should be like. Of course, it shouldn't be just one sentence, like the only sentence, because it's just nothing. At least you have to provide your students with 2 or even more target grammar, I would say, sentences. Then all your sentences should be relevant for your student. It shouldn't be somewhere out of the blue. It should be really, it should have kind of practical application. It should be possible to meet it in real life communication. And of course, don't forget that this particular stage should take up to 10 minutes. If you do feel that it takes too much time to work with the context, you might skip, right, the tasks with details, with intensive reading or with intensive listening, and be focused only on the gist, right, and then go to the language focus. This would be a priority for grammar. As for language focus, here we're going to take a look at some aspects of grammar. If we're talking about grammar, which aspects do you personally focus on while presenting a new grammar piece? Do you only discuss, for example, form, or only meaning, or anything else, or maybe several aspects just at the same time, for example? Which ones? Of course, you might even cover some other like aspects of grammar, including register, style, appropriacy, whatever that might be suitable for the context. But the question is, do you think that the specific order matters? Or we can cover these aspects in a like random order? Of course it matters. And what should we start with? What do you think? We would definitely start with the meaning. As for the rest of other aspects, actually that's up to you to decide. So what would you go next? What would you go with next? But that would probably be dictated by your students, by your students' demands, by the context, and by the purpose. But meaning really has to come first. Because again, we're talking about inductive approach, because our students are supposed to understand why exactly they go through this kind of, I would say, this grammar piece. Of course, pronunciation features matter a lot, right? It's also critical and crucial to cover pronunciation just because there is an obvious reason for that. We would either want our students like to perceive grammar by listening, or probably produce the target grammar by speaking without knowing how to pronounce it, how it sounds in real life. It's going to be tricky to recognize it in the context. Okay, let's summarize. Meaning goes first, and then it's up to you. What would you continue with? Form, pronunciation features, and so on and so forth. And after that, style, register, appropriacy. Okay, let's practice. Let's take a look at how we would have to do the language focus. So imagine that I'm your elementary student, and that is my first encounter in terms of past simple regular. So if you were in this teacher's shoes, imagine how would you present this language stage? How would you present, like, for example, meaning, form, pronunciation? What would you start with? How exactly can you elicit information? Let's have a look. As I've already mentioned, meaning goes first. That is why you would have to elicit the meaning, I would say, of these words that are underlined by asking a few CCQs, a few questions. Instead of, again, giving this rule out straight away, you would have to, I would say, engage your student. Your student would have to be immersed, and by means of asking questions, so it might facilitate this work. So what about the number of questions? What questions would we have to ask here to elicit the meaning? Let's have a look. First and foremost, we might ask our students, are these actions in the present or in the past? Look, last April, you might even use different gestures. And your student would have to answer, yes, these actions are in the past. Are these actions, for example, finished, like stop? You may even use different words like stop. Probably yes. Okay. Then you might even just show a kind of timeline, right? Or you might ask the student the following question: do we know when it happened? It happened, for example, yes. And here, by trial and error, our students will have to come up to the meaning of this structure. Afterwards, we are likely to be talking about form. For instance, what is the ending of all the words? Look, want, wanted, look, looked, book, booked, wait, waited. What do you see? What do you see? Ed ending, ed, right? Or you can even use a kind of table with the present simple and the past simple. And your students would have to compare to see the difference between the present simple, want, and the past simple, wanted. And as for pronunciation features, of course, this part matters a lot, but instead of overloading your students with all the rules, you would have to simply drill the words. Yeah, we're talking about our students' first encounter with this topic. Just drill these words, then chunks, and then sentences. Wanted, like wanted to go. Looked, looked for cheap tickets. Or checked, checked in and waited, and so on and so forth. Again, don't overload your students. Otherwise, so probably you wouldn't get any results at all. Okay, there is one more case. Let's proceed with one more case. And imagine that I'm your intermediate student, and you've just generated this context. So there are two pictures here, as you can see. and two sentences. So you would have to teach this piece of grammar inductively without L1 and mind that my current level is upper intermediate. Again, how would you present this piece of grammar but inductively? What kind of questions would you ask in this particular case? And of course, these two pictures here are going to be used by you because they might be really, really handy. So, of course, it's a tricky thing to do because, again, you would have to take lots of things into account. Without L1, inductive approach, and your students your students should be involved here. Okay, how do we do this MFP focus stage here? Let's have a look. We would have to start again to elicit some information by means of asking a few CCQs, concept checking questions, right? For example, was he doing something before he played with children? Oh yeah, yes. We may just take a look at this picture and you might have noticed that he was working. Did he stop that action? Oh yeah, he stopped this action. But why? Just in order to play with these children. And afterwards, we would have to elicit the form. For example, what form do we have to put after, for example, stopped? Oh, to and just the verb or infinitive, right? And finally, you would have to drill some pronunciation features like elision. You would have to highlight elision and drill stop to, or make some substitution drills. As for the second sentence, the procedure is the same. You don't have to use anything else. But again, the structure is the same. First and foremost, you would have to ask a few CCQs to elicit this structure. Then you would have to cover the form, and finally, pronunciation features. Again, like a number of questions. You can see a number of questions. For example, was he playing with his children? Yes. Did he stop that action? Yes. So he stopped doing something, he stopped that action, and afterwards elicit the form. Again, what form of the verb do we put after stopped? Okay, look, in form, in or gerund, if your student is quite brainy, I would say. And again, drill, stopped playing, highlight elision. It's not so simple as it seems to be, just because you have to be watchful. You have to ask quite relevant questions, not just questions that might come out of the blue, something relevant, right, in terms of these particular pictures. Okay, let's have a look which questions here cover meaning, which ones form, and which pronunciation. First and foremost, the first three questions covered meaning, one more question covered form, and the last question covered pronunciation. The same about the second case. The first two questions covered meaning, one more question covered form, and only the last question covered pronunciation. Okay, afterwards, when this piece of grammar is just displayed or presented, we would have to deal with some more exercises, I would say, to practice more so as to add to your students' confidence. But the question is, what should a controlled practice exercise be like? Of course, we would have to start with the easiest exercises like matching and categorizing so as to add to our students' confidence. Our students, they really need to make sure that they're able to operate with this structure quite well. Until afterwards, we're going to jump forward to filling in the gaps or drilling or close-ended questions, sentence transformations, and so on and so forth. That is called from the easiest to the most difficult, from reception to production. And the last stage, if we're talking about a new grammar piece, we would have to set like kind of communicative setting, and our student would have to apply the target grammar but in a communicative setting. The question is, what do you see as a communicative activity suitable for free practice here? I'm giving you a number of different activities and you would have to guess which activities are considered to be communicative and why. Okay, let's take a look. I'm giving you a few seconds. Okay, let us check our results. Actually, communicative activities are the following. The second one, planning summer holidays. It's a purely communicative activity because there is like an interaction between a student and the teacher. Complaining to a writer, undoubtedly, or I would say precisely, because again, there is some interaction and we're talking about production. Talking about a film one has recently watched, here it's also purely communicative activity because the student might express his or her own point of view. And of course, giving advice about what to wear, it's quite a typical activity where our students would have to give some tips about what to wear and so on and so forth, and writing a message to a friend to arrange a meeting. Of course, it's not like a speaking activity, it's a writing activity, but as you remember, writing and speaking are like indispensable parts and they are quite interrelated. And also we're talking about some kind of production, writing a message to a friend to arrange a meeting. As for the rest of these exercises, they are not considered to be communicative activities because there is no interaction inside and I would say behind these activities. For example, list objects in the picture. It might be like a hilarious case when you're sitting with a cup of coffee and start listing these objects. It's not a kind of interaction. It's just, I would say, producing like a few words. There is a picture, there is a picture, and so on and so forth. Okay, as for like, as for children, if we are talking about young learners, just for young learners, it's so it's not so typical to, I would say, to explain grammar deductively because I would say they don't. So probably they might start yawning, or they are not ready to grasp all the information deductively and also inductively. Instead, you might not overload our young learners with all the rules, but show some visuals. For example, one sock, two socks. So they should be like some visual aids to facilitate your work here. And as for timing, I would say, first and foremost, again, you would have to be aware of a strict sequence of slides. First and foremost, as for the very first stage, warm up in Leiden, it should take up to 10 minutes maximum. The second stage, content-centered generated examples, also it should take up to 10 minutes. The same about language focus, controlled practice activity, but as for the last stage that is called communicative activity, you would have to spend at least 10, it's better 15 minutes, because again, we are following communicative approach. Our main aim is to help our students speak fluently, and instead of going through controlled practice activity, you might just reduce time there and be focused on communicative activities. So as you've just noticed, we just covered two main approaches, inductive and deductive grammar approaches. The goal of the inductive grammar approach is delivering a message using new knowledge, not learning the rule itself. We're talking about meaning rather than form. When teaching inductively, don't give out rules, but elicit them using guided discovery, using inductive method with the help of different CCQs. And of course, practice building CCQs for the sake of asking good questions during the MFP stage. I do hope that you've just got, I would say, the main idea about inductive grammar approach, and I hope to see you next time if we're talking about our practical part. Thank you so much for your attention. Goodbye.